Thank you very much. Thank you for the possibility to speak here. Thank you for the kind words. And as time is short, I go directly into my topic. Plotinus and St. Augustine, love as unifier, love as tri-unifier. Very briefly for the introduction, it was given ahead in part anyway already. Love structures, directs, unifies. This is so on many levels, as is obvious at least from and since the development of the ladder of love in Plato's Symposium. Love in the end, beyond all subordinate efforts at unification, unites with or at least points to our origin. Love also intrinsically differentiates. It can at least be seen in strong actualizations of love that the relata, so lover and beloved, are intensified in their being. If this is so, it seems at least thinkable that there is an instance of so perfect love that in it lover, love, and beloved are three and one. Love is then the inner life of the most perfect mind. The first of these two systematic points, or love as transcending, is in this paper developed first with the pagan Platonic tradition, chapter 1, the same movement within Christian thinking. I want to spell out via looking at the primarily early St. Augustine, chapter 2, and the second point, love as in a second systematic point, love as intrinsically differentiating, is here arrived at via the later St. Augustine, my chapter 3. Chapter 1, love as unifier 1, Plato and Plotinus. The first great thinkers, if we briefly look back, the first great thinkers of first origins do this, thinking completely radicalized, universalized, without any exterior limits. What results is necessarily principle theory or origin metaphysics. Now, Plato and Plotinus in his wake unfolds origin metaphysics as unity metaphysics, so as henology in which his theory of being is being, so his ontology is grounded. And this systematically reflects fundamental reality itself. The drive into the love for the oneness of their origin is the true essence of things. The principle of principles, therefore, in Plato is the one. The thought of the one is the only completely independent thought. Plotinus, as I assume you recall, has very good arguments there. There is nothing that is or can be thought, conceptualized, imagined, felt, that it would not yet be subordinate to and participating in the one. The one is therefore, and I for once quote Plato here, the one is therefore the king of all things, panton basileus. It transcends all things, even being. The development of thinking as transcending, of thinking as ascensus, is closed and complete with Plato. What has this to do with love? In order to see how Plato thinks love, I think 3 points are absolutely necessary. First, what do we want? Always want, will, always will, love, always love. It is A, says Plato, the good, to agathon. It is B, that we participate in the good, are connected with it, have it, heautoenai, and it is Z, that we participate in the good forever, always, I. That's the first point. Second point that we need as far as Plato's thinking of love is concerned, in this my paper here, love is therefore defined in Plato as the activity of engendering and begetting upon the beautiful, tes genesios kai tutoku ento kalo, in the formulation out of the Symposium. Third point, Plato about love, this non-contingent desire, drive, directedness is, as are so many things in Plato, gradualized the ladder of love, which we heard quite something about it before already. We start with simple, often very silly things. They are silly because they are more or less, rather less, so also left soon. Every mixture of the beautiful, to put it directly systematically in Plato, every mixture of the beautiful and the non-beautiful presupposes the beautiful. So the ladder of love is a ladder of transcending. We want to arrive at the beautiful, again, non-contingently, the beautiful itself, autotokalongis. One, closing this my first part, one quote out of Plato, in which persuasion, says Socrates, I pursue my neighbors to persuade them that in turn, that towards this acquisition of the first principle, the best helper that our human nature can hope to find is love, unquote. I make the jump to Plotinus, all searching, mentally, intellectually, emotionally, desiring whatever ends with him, as Plotinus puts it, with the highest principle, with God. This is just fine. But in Plotinus, the identification of this first principle with will, with being, with essence, with actuality is always connected with the, and here I use Werner Bayerwald's terminology, with the Hoion reservation, Hoion Vorbehalt, as Bayerwald puts it. In itself, the one, the first principle, transcends all will, all love, all being, all essence, all actuality. It is not in itself unified duality, but pure, absolutely non-plural oneness. This brings it with it. Should we say that there is a quasi-relation to everything that is subordinate to the one, to the first principle, to God in Plotinus. There is somehow a love towards itself, an inclination towards itself. Love is directed inwards and upwards. In the case of the highest principle, of course, not upwards, because there is nothing higher, but quasi-inwards, hoion inwards, or quodamodo inwards, to use that word combination. Again, because the one is not in itself, strictly speaking, because that would presuppose duality already. Was far away here is downward bending love, caritas, agape. This is what is then necessarily absent, even though the nous eron is so important in Plotinus, even though eros transcends phronesis in Plotinus, which I want to stress here, because it is more intensely one, more intensely unitive. Eros unites more than phronesis. But as we saw, it is always a striving that is directed and directing inwards and upwards, never downwards. So no groundwork for discensus, for incarnation, for kenosis in Plotinus, but only for ascensus. The Christians, or the downward directed love, caritas, it is very far away, the love of the lost son, and the love not of the lost son, sorry, but rather of the Good Samaritan. That's my chapter 1. Chapter 2, love as unifier to St. Augustine. I start here with a very early text, De Beata Vita. Beatitudo is the end, the final end, says St. Augustine. But not everything that we desire makes us happy, obviously. Therefore, St. Monica, in this St. Augustinian dialogue, insists on felicity or happiness resulting from the presence of goodness, bonum, and you always see the parallels between Plato and the St. Augustine section here, I assume, but also the presence of this or that good is very fleeting. And so if we want to speak of happiness in an intellectually serious sense, the permanence of the presence of the good needs to be guaranteed. 2 points are included here, says St. Augustine. The good needs to be always present to him who can be truly called happy, and the good, which is to guarantee permanent happiness, needs to be eternal and unalterable. This good can only be the first principle, and origin can only be God, says St. Augustine. We therefore, if that is all completely conclusive, we therefore always need to love God, as this love is our link to our happiness, which we necessarily desire. St. Augustine, and I point to a very much later passage here in passing in the Civitate Dei, argues in the same way again, but on a higher level. Every being that is not God can only be happy, or more generally can only reach its causa finalis, its aim, quote, not out of itself, but because it has been created out of nothing, but through him who created it, unquote. Plotinus, as we saw before, everything reaches its aim via self-transcendence, being united to his origin, which is the one. St. Augustine, he who loves God, is directed towards his objectively existing causa finalis. This is his happiness. This is not only an ethical principle. So next step within still this my part 2. This is not only an ethical principle, but a principle of being as well. So St. Augustine has this excellent Neoplatonic reditus conception, which in the end governs all creatures. He speaks of the gravity or weight of the soul, the pondus of the soul. What is the weight? What is the directedness, the inbuilt directedness of the soul? It is, says St. Augustine, as says the early St. Augustine already, it's delight or joy, delectatio, his word. The real delectatio is to delight in God, towards whom the soul of man is directed by nature. So to love God is the weight of the soul in his formulation, pondus meum amor meus, so my weight is my love. These famous words out of the Confessions can be associated here as well. There is the Neoplatonic connection further between self-knowledge and return from exile, return from strange lands. It could be and was connected in many ways. We just heard things about Philo before. Can be connected in many ways in schools with the, be it Babylonian exile and the prophets announcing return. The Psalms singing the desire of a whole people for the distant fatherland. It can also be associated with the complex of Nostos and Anagnorisis in the Ulysses mythology and Stoic and other late antique contexts. For St. Augustine, this connection between self-knowledge and return to God, return from strange lands, is even of more importance or greater importance because it can be clearly linked with the parable of the lost son, Luke 15. I just put in one other quote out of St. Augustine: seeing in ourselves his image, let us return to ourselves and rise like the younger son in the gospel and go back to him from whom we have separated ourselves off through sin, unquote. A little bit back again in time and looking most directly at the topic of love in St. Augustine, there's the important Question 35 out of the text Convolute de diversis questionibus octoginta tribus. St. Augustine defines love here. He says, for to love, quote again, for to love is nothing other than to desire something for its own sake. Nihil enim aliud est amare, quam propter se ipsam rem aliquam appetere, unquote. Also here there is, of course, gradualization, which we had before already in the context of the ladder of love in Plato. The whole question of the whole title of the question 35 actually is quid amandum sit. And I quote him again, what is the thing whose love should be loved, if not what cannot disappear while it is being loved? But to possess that is nothing but to know it, unquote. So love is desiring an object, the contents for its own sake. It is decisive that this contents is in the end the highest contents, the summum bonum, God himself. Otherwise, we run into a muddle and errors concerning the distinctions between the uti and fui, so this famous Ciceronian St. Augustine distinction between striving for something as an end or as a means. It's going to be easy in the end. Love is object directed towards the best object. If this object is in itself love, then, as St. Augustine here just starts to develop, then love is loved. Not only, as it were, as our way to the end, but as characterizing that very end intrinsically within itself. As soon as we see this, we make the step from thinking the first cause of everything as the one, Plato, Plotinus, or mind, Aristotle, to seeing it as within itself, willing or loving as well, St. Augustine. As soon as we see this, we make in this my narrative the step from chapter 2 to chapter 3. My last chapter, chapter 3, love as Tri-Unifier. St. Augustine. One could see the developments described in the two chapters up to now as parallel. The pagan Platonists and St. Augustine, they both transcend polytheism, they both transcend the many worldly ends. Generally speaking, they both transcend the many. So this is thinking as transcending, thinking as chances, the way in which Plato himself defined philosophy already. They see love, both of them see, so everything that I described up to now in my first two chapters, we've seen love as the motivation aspect, the powering aspect of thinking as transcending. This is what we have in Plato, this is what we have in the St. Augustinian texts that I put in up to now in this paper. Now I jump into, in this my third part, I jump into the Trinitate 9, very briefly, so very much later, St. Augustinian thinking, if there is mind. So to look into the Trinitate 9 just very concentratedly, it's of course a difficult text. If there is mind, the way in which St. Augustine argues here, if there is mind and this as perfect, so without the many privative aspects which we experience in ourselves, and then always sillily, anthropomorphistically attribute to mind itself, whereas there are only privations of our human thinking. So if there is mind and this is perfect, without these many privative aspects, then there is this, and I quote St. Augustine here, De Trinitate 9, the mind, therefore, and its love and knowledge are three somethings, and these three are one thing. And when they are complete, they are equal, et cum perfecta sunt, equalia sunt, unquote. Threefold. But what St. Augustine asks us to think here is simply this: threefold complete self-relatedness, self-presence, self-knowledge, self-love. If we think about these three things, if and as these are perfect, these three are one. If this is true, then it's impossible that two of them are only attributes. So if they are one, it's not possible that one is substance, the other two are attributes only. What we have, therefore, is one and the same being, but as it were, unmixed in three. This can hardly be addressed in a better way than speaking of a tri-personal substance. The same thing with St. Augustine can be seen in the triad amans, amatus, amor, thought as perfect. So again, without the silly privative aspects that we always include when we're thinking about our own very limited ways of loving or being loved, but thinking all that away, we see and think three who are one, amans, amator, et amor. This is tri-unity, trinity thought in a completely non-arbitrary and rational way. If this is true, then with it we have immanently Trinitarian thinking of will and love. St. Augustine, so I take another last starting point within the late St. Augustine. St. Augustine thinks God as being love, to put it in another way, as being love substantively. One could, of course, point into the Revelation background. God is of course, mind, John 4:24, God is love, or theos agapeistin, 1 John 4. God as a love needs to know himself, otherwise he could not love himself. Now, to know and to love, neither of these is in a subject like color or size, because they are transcending their subject, which is not the case with color and size. They are ways of being things. Loving and knowing are ways of being things. So should we say the wonderfully objectivistic conception of loving and thinking that we still have in St. Augustine. They are ways of being things, intellectually in the one case with thinking, voluntatively in the other case with loving. The extent of self-knowledge and self-love in God seem to be necessarily identical, namely perfect. And then it seems to follow love can and does exist substantively. But if so, it pluralizes in a timelessly eternal way within its oneness. This is what I call love as the Tri-Unifier. One could perhaps, a few concluding remarks, one could perhaps say that agape is endlessly, so still staying within St. Augustine, is endless self-giving, which is exactly what we have in the inner Trinitarian relations. Now, this endless self-giving is within the Trinity love of the endlessly lovable, obviously, identity of subject and object in God himself, but it is love. And so there is a motivator for bowing down. So this bowing down or stepping down movement of love, whereas philia and eros are human ways of trying to reach this level of love. They are inwards and they are upwards. To sum up, the question of this paper was simply, is the object of love, so the final object of love itself love? Or is love our mover towards the ultimate good, only that within itself transcends love, as we've seen placatively within Plotinus? If the second, so the Plotinian option, then it would seem that this ultimate reality itself is non-intentional, then it is not plural within itself, and then, of course, we have a dissension problem. So how then can we make a rational state from the first principle to any principiatum? The argument and conclusion of this paper would simply seem to be love as transcending is completed in love as self-giving. So seeing love not only as mover upwards, but intrinsically qualifying the end principle of all loved things. Love is always intentional, as is thinking. Plotinus, to mention him a last time, Plotinus shows that both human freedom and human thinking are impossible without transcendence relation. This is also true for freedom and thinking on the highest possible level, namely the one of the nous. This is so because only in the one, the pure one that transcends thinking, there is more than just a correspondence of essence and actuality is ensued, and this specific more than is presupposed, argues Plotinus, for any correspondence whatever. On the other side, St. Augustine also, of course, love is always intentional, but if the highest reality transcends intentionality, then it would transcend love. And then there would seem to be a strictly irrational jump from the first principle to any principiatum, to any second highest reality. Love must therefore certainly be seen as transcending certain types of intentionality. I called these types eros and philia here. So why would the world be necessary for God being God? There was no reason for that, but it cannot be seen as transcending a type of intentionality which does not destroy pure unity. And this seems to be exactly what we have in divine triune love. Thank you very much.